It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, as always. From the flight deck, and of course, some smart talk radio is in your future. This segment, an interesting segment indeed. A brand new work called The Nazi Titanic, the incredible untold story of a doomed ship in World War II. Our special guest this segment is Robert P. Watson. He's a prominent historian and frequent political commentator, also the author or editor of 36 books, including America's First Crisis, which received a 2014 Independent Publisher Book Award Gold Medal for History. He lives in the gorgeous Sunshine State of Florida, where he's enjoying the humidity indeed, and we're pleased to have him. Robert, how are you, my friend?
Good, thank you, and I appreciate the invitation to be on your show.
Yeah, happy to have you here. Well, let's do this first. Let's give people a little bit more information about you. Tell us about Robert P. Watson. Why history for you as a career, and in particular, as we lead towards this, why this particular story?
Okay, well, this is year 26 as a professor, and one of the things I love to do is write books on history. I know I grew up in central to eastern Pennsylvania, hop and skip and jump from Valley Forge, Gettysburg, the site of the Liberty Bell. So I suppose it's genetic. All this wonderful American history was all around me. And much of my work is on American political history, military history, and so forth. I never intended to write this book. What I was going to do is I was going to write a book on the last week of World War II in Europe. You know, that's the one aspect of the war that we really don't know that much about. When the war ended in Europe, we had to immediately pivot our attention to the Pacific and Asia. There was the dropping of the bomb. You had all the post-war questions with, millions of refugees and displaced people. Fields had been fallow through the war, so there were prospects of global hunger. Bridges, roads, airports, everything was blown up around the world. So a momentous task after the war, and most people had war fatigue and were ready to move on to something a little lighter. So the world kind of forgot about that last week. I was working on a book on some of the triumphs and tragedies and loves and losses that occurred in the final moments of the war, and I found a letter. By dumb mistake, just a dumb luck, found a letter by a major in the British Army who was writing in 1945 at the end of the war. His name was Till, T-I-L-L. And in the letter, this Major Till says, of all the horrors of the war, the one nightmare that I will never erase from my memory was when thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent people were killed in the final moments of the war. And I read that letter and I thought, oh my goodness, what is he talking about? I don't recall ever reading about or learning about such an incident. So I called some prominent Holocaust scholars, some prominent World War II scholars, and said, what on earth is this letter about? And they all said, there was no such incident. Must be a forgery, a mistake, miscommunication. So I called the Holocaust museums, World War II museums, and nobody had heard of anything. So what would you have done? Probably what I did, and that is I skipped writing my other book and never wrote that book, in fact, the other one, and I started doing my research, playing detective, and trying to find out what on earth this Major Till was writing about, and it led me to the archives in London. And what happened at the end of the war, there was this incident involving this ship where thousands and thousands of prisoners from the Holocaust were killed. And the British government was so appalled, embarrassed by what had happened, that someone ordered all the documents sealed, get this, until the year 2045, which would make it the 100-year secret.
Wow.
So I dug and found that boxes of this stuff were still sitting there. So happily they released everything. Happily the Imperial War Museum of London could not have been more helpful in digitizing all the documents and giving me access to 100% of them. And what emerged was this book. So I always like to tell my students and friends and readers that history still has her secrets, including some whoppers. I mean, who would think that something as well known as World War II or the Holocaust could still be harboring such momentous and tragic secrets?
Right. And again, I want to make sure I get the name right. This was about the ship known as the Cap Arcona. Is that correct? Did I pronounce it?
Exactly.
Okay.
You're exactly right.
The Cap Arcona, and in essence, and I'll let you explain in more detail, but it was at one time a gorgeous ocean liner, kind of rivaling, again, the Titanic. The war starts, and the Germans go, nope, we don't need a luxury ship. We really need something more that will help our military as a floating barracks or something to that effect. So they strip it, and either following the strip or as part of the strip, it was also used, I believe, in a propaganda film based around the sinking of the Titanic. Is that correct?
You're exactly right on all fronts. So the Germans launched this luxurious ocean liner called the Cap Arcona in 1927. And what it was Germany always prided itself in building some of the world's finest ships. And in the years after World War I, the German economy had gone belly up, of course, since they were the belligerent nation in the war. They were severely punished after the war, and partially for national pride, partially to try to resurrect its once proud and profitable shipping industry, they decided they were going to build the new Titanic. And Blum and Voss, this famous shipping company, which is still in existence near Hamburg, and Hamburg, South America, known as Hamburg Süd, which is still in existence, they built this ship. It's launched, and it rivals the Titanic. It looks like the Titanic. It's almost as big. It's opulent with a grand staircase, 7-course dinners, heated pool, walking track, a full symphony orchestra on board, and the creme de la creme from around the world sailed on this ship. American actors, Clark Gable sailed on it, European monarchs. But then the war comes, and of course that's the end of this Titanic. Hitler comes to power. World War II in 1933, World War II in 39, and here's what happens. Number one, it turns out that Hitler and some of the top Nazis like Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, they're crazy about big ships. So they use this ship for propaganda purposes, essentially announcing to the world, your Titanic sunk, but our Titanic is still floating, and it is truly unsinkable. And they boast about famous people around the world are all clamoring to be on our ship. We do it the best. So the Nazis used it as the pride of the Third Reich, and it earns the nickname the Nazi Titanic instead of the Titanic. During the war, by 1942, the war is taking a turn for the worse, thank goodness, for the Nazis. The Eastern Front, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, that collapses when the cold Russian winter killed, countless Germans. The Southern Front, the Nazi invasion of North Africa, that fails, and Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and the Nazis are kicked out of North Africa. The Western Front, Nazi Germany's effort to invade England, that doesn't work, Operation Sea Lion. So the Nazis are now desperate. The war has changed. So Hitler and Goebbels have this secret meeting. And it sounds like some crazy scene from a James Bond movie or an Austin Powers farce. They decide they need to create some epic, diabolical thing that will change the war. They need to do something that will make the world hate the Allies and love the Nazis. So what they come up with is the idea of making a propaganda movie. So Hitler basically tells Goebbels that he's going to be the producer, and he's supposed to make the world's greatest and most diabolical propaganda film that will change the course of the war. These two guys are so delusional, they're putting the future of the war in the hands of a movie. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to launch what they called Hollywood on the Rhine. What happened was Hitler and Goebbels loved movies, and they particularly loved Hollywood movies. They watched them all the time. They watched King Kong over and over and over, Gone with the Wind over and over and over. Believe it or not, they watched Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs all the time. So they love these Hollywood movies. The Hollywood movie they hated was Casablanca, because it was essentially, if you recall, an anti-Nazi propaganda film.
Yeah.
Right, but it was wrapped up with great writing, great screenwriting, great acting, great directing. It was a great drama, action, romance. So what they wanted to do was make their version of Casablanca, and they decided to make a Nazi version of the movie The Titanic, only make the Nazi Titanic and make it a propaganda film. And one of the things that caused them to do that was it dawned on Hitler and Goebbels while they were just voraciously consuming Hollywood films. And they would sit around debating these movies for hours. They considered themselves Siskel and Ebert. I might be dating myself with that reference, but these two were like the Nazi version of Siskel and Ebert, just analyzing films nonstop. But what had dawned on them was many of Hollywood's greatest producers, directors, screenwriters, actors, and so forth were Jewish. So they were outraged by that. So the plan is to make the Nazi Titanic, and they had a star for the movie. They were going to use their own Titanic, the Cap Arcona, to make this epic propaganda film to change the tide of the war.
Well, again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, in the middle of a good one here with Robert P. Watson, well-known historian and author, been a part and parcel of 36 different works, and a brand new work called The Nazi Titanic, The Incredible Untold Story of a Doomed Ship in World War II, specifically the Cap Arcona. Well, then the question becomes, all right, we have a ship that was built for passengers. Now we're using it in the movie. Now we're going to be using it as for military purposes, most specifically almost like a floating concentration camp, so to speak. And then the unthinkable would happen, so to speak, and which you discovered, and that was that it was bombed and ultimately destroyed by the Allies. And the question, undoubtedly, that you get every time, and we'll ask it here, is did they know that, in fact, basically innocent people were on board?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. The short answer is yes and no, and I'll flesh that out for you. So what happens is that movie goes belly up. The Nazis make that movie. It's the most expensive movie ever made at the time. But what happens is when they finish making the movie, the director filmed the movie with a lot of propaganda, but he turned it around and made it full of anti-Nazi propaganda. And Joseph Goebbels refused to release the film inside Germany. So at the very end of the war, they decide to use the ship as a floating concentration camp. What happens is Heinrich Himmler of the SS and Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler is secretly trying to cut a deal. And the deal is he wants the concentration camps that are not yet liberated, he wants the commandants to move tens of thousands, mostly Jewish concentration camp prisoners, all the way to the Baltic in the north of Germany. And he wants to take them there and put them on a ship. So, of course, the ship he picks is the Nazi Titanic, the Cap Arcona. What he wants to do is he wants to sail with the ship and take thousands and thousands of concentration camp prisoners and exchange them with Eisenhower or Montgomery, with the Allies, for his own life. He wants to negotiate a separate surrender on the Western Front and wants to negotiate for his own life. While he's in the process of doing this, Hitler learns about it, and Hitler sends two assassins to kill Himmler. Himmler takes off his uniform, exchanges his identity, and goes on the run. In the final moments of the war, final days of the war, Hitler committed suicide, Goebbels commits suicide, Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe commander's on the run, Heinrich Himmler's on the run. It's over. But what there are is there's still thousands and thousands of Holocaust prisoners at the port in Lubeck Bay on the southern Baltic, and there's thousands and thousands loaded up in this ship. And no one knows what to do with them. There's not adequate food. There's inadequate medicine, no water. People are dying by the dozens and hundreds per day on board the ship. And the Nazis keep jamming thousands more on the ship. So there's two Nazis in charge of the Baltic, a guy named Count George von Basovitz-Baer and one named Karl Kaufmann with a K and a K. They'd come up with this plan. Let's scuttle the ship. Let's sink it with everyone on board. We'll do it at the final moment, right when we sign the surrender. We will therefore liquidate all evidence of the concentration camps. We'll kill all the remaining prisoners there, and we will deny the Allies from getting our beloved Nazi Titanic, the pride of the Third Reich, Hitler's favorite ship. So right when they're ready to do this, the British 6th Commando, backed by a Scottish unit and a tank unit, come pouring into the Baltic, and they make quick work of the Nazis, killing most of the soldiers, and they surrender, and the British are forcing them to sign the surrender. As they're doing this, the folks that are still alive at the port are saying, you need to get out there to the British and rescue people on this giant ship. The ship was so big it couldn't even dock at the port. They had to drop anchor 3 kilometers out into the Baltic. And people are dying in mass numbers per day. So right before the British can rush out to the ship and save people, there's a deafening sound in the sky. Everyone looks upward, and 6 squadrons of British bombers fly into the Baltic and blow up the Nazi Titanic, killing thousands and thousands and thousands instantly. Now, did they know? You and I know the difference between an ocean liner and a cruise ship. And a battleship. You and I know the difference between uniformed sailors and concentration camp prisoners in striped pajamas. However, it was very overcast that day. It was raining. The clouds were such that the British had to drop down, the bombers had to drop down below 2,000 feet to hit it. They were susceptible to anti-aircraft fire, so they came in fast, hard, and got out. Secondly, there was a rumor that some Nazis would try to flee to Norway, which was still occupied by the Nazis, and use the geographic isolation, the cold weather, the mountains, and the deep fjords to hide out and make one final last stand. And the Allies were worried that the Nazis would use ocean liners like this ship that could transport thousands of soldiers to Norway. So some of the pilots that knew that these ships were not warships bombed them nevertheless. Tragically, the day before the bombing, at the very end of the war, a Swedish count, a head of the Red Cross named Folke Bernadotte from Stockholm, was down trying to liberate prisoners like an Oskar Schindler or a Wallenberg. And he takes about 1,500 prisoners off the ship. Of course, the Nazis put thousands more back on it. And he notifies the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, that there are concentration camp survivors on board that plane. Now, he notified Bomber Command. Unbelievably, ironically, and tragically, that day, the British were so short-staffed, you might say, that they shifted responsibility from Bomber Command to Fighter Command. So fighter, and someone never passed along the memo or the word. So some of the pilots that hit him that day had no idea. Others saw that it was an ocean liner, but they blew it up nonetheless.
Did they? Was the Cap Arcona, was it armed at all?
It was not. Now, here's another irony. Nazi Germany was, as you correctly noted earlier, all ocean liners, passenger ships, fishing boats, everything was reassigned to the Kriegsmarine, which is the Nazi Navy. And what they did with ocean liners, they would put machine guns on the side and mount a cannon or two. So many, in fact, 2 of her sister ships built in the Cap ocean liner fleet had weapons on board and were blown up. But the Cap Arcona did not have a single weapon on board. In fact, they were some of the sailors on board were trying to wave their hands, put up a white flag. They even tried to paint a red cross on the funnels. They were trying desperately to do something, but it was overcast. It was the fog of war. They did not have time to notify them, and they were not firing back. Ironically, there was another ship in the Baltic that day firing back, another cargo ship, but the Cap Arcona was completely defenseless.
So as we start to wind down here, a question for you, and that is, how have the British reconciled themselves to this? What's there? And I know obviously people alive today were not a part of this, but how is this sitting in British wartime history, do you think?
It's a mixed bag. On one hand, the British knowingly sealed all the documents and tried to cover this up and hide it. Now, does that mean Winston Churchill did it or General Montgomery? Probably not. We still don't know the name or names of the officials that locked them away. On the other hand, the folks with the archives, the leadership of the Imperial War Museum in London, they could not have been more helpful to me in terms of their releasing of the documents, making them available, having archivists help me understand them. They could literally not have been more helpful. I devote some time at the beginning of my book to singing their praises for how helpful they were. However, one of the things I want to do next month, the book is still pretty recent, and I just finished the second book tour, and I'm a professor. We have the start of the semester this month. So next month, one of my goals is I would like the British government to offer an official acknowledgement of what they did. Not an apology, but an acknowledgement. There are still people alive that were in the Holocaust. There are still people alive that were in the Second World War. There are family members, loved ones. For their memory, I do think the British do need to fess up and acknowledge what turned out to be history's worst single incident of friendly fire, the single bloodiest hour of the entire Holocaust, and without a doubt one of the world's most tragic maritime disasters. So we do need an acknowledgement that can maybe bring just a wee bit of closure to those that lost loved ones that tragic day at the end of the war.
Yeah. Well, boy, we could talk about this for a long time. Fascinating work. I guess one real quick thing. Congratulations on the work and the work that you did. Are you surprised that it took you to find this information out and make this public? It's astonishing to me that, I mean, congratulations to you, but it's astonishing that this story has not been told before.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I always tell my students that history still has her secrets. And even though we know a lot about history, there's more we don't know than we do know. Most documents, most people that ever lived never left behind writing, and most documents have disappeared or burned or decomposed over the years. There were two German scholars years ago that interviewed a couple of people that were alive at the Baltic, and they wrote a little bit about it. There were some photographs that have been released, but this has remained virtually unknown for 7 decades, and yet the Holocaust and World War II are two of the pivotal events of not just the 20th century, but human history. So and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm the opposite. I'm a very rational historian, but I can't help but to think, what else is still out there? What is still locked away? And I'm reminded of that. Do you remember the closing scene in Indiana Jones, The Raiders of the Lost Ark, when some bureaucrat puts the Ark in a box and puts it in the basement of the National Archives, along with 1 million other documents, and that's all she wrote.
Right.
So.
Well, again, the work is The Nazi Titanic, the incredible untold story of a doomed ship in World War II. Fascinating work by Robert P. Watson, well-known historian and also professor. Robert, how can people get a copy of the book and find out a little bit more about some of the other works that you've done?
Oh, I've got a website all about the book. It's NaziTitanic.com, just NaziTitanic.com. Also, they can go to my own website, robertwatson.net. And this book is available audio, Kindle, paperback, hardback, and translation, anywhere books are sold, Amazon.com or anywhere.
Well, we appreciate,
Thank you, Warner.
Yeah, we appreciate you very much being on and sharing with us today. This in the back of my head, this screams to be made into a movie. But who knows, right?
Well, we'll see, and then maybe I'll cast you as the dashing captain who tried to prevent the attack. How's that sound?
Yeah, as long as I live through to the very end, I'm happy. All right. Well, listen, thanks so much, and would love to have you on again sometime.
Thank you, Warner. I appreciate it. Good luck with your program.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.